Hey folks, and welcome to the first mini lecture of the week. We're discussing the revolutions in the Atlantic world. In this mini lecture, I'm going to talk generally about the French Revolution and its ties to the American Revolution. So we may as well erect the old guillotine and shorten some noblemen and clergy. The Atlantic world is about to get really messy. So we're going to start with the French because they revolted first, and then we'll pop into the Haitian Revolution. So any revolution is based in a mix of external and internal factors, and of course the French Revolution is no different. Since we're not giving a comparative history throughout the course, we have to broad stroke a lot of this, but I'm going to try and highlight some of the ties between the American, French, and Haitian revolutions this week. Among the causes of the French Revolution are rising social and economic inequality. There has been a lot of recent discussion in economic circles about how inequality contributes to instability. And the France before the Revolution was a profoundly unequal society. A few statistics for you to help illustrate this. Out of a total population of roughly 26 million people, 21 million of them were rural peasants, and the majority did not own arable land and worked as poorly paid agricultural labor. It's a pretty insecure mode of living. Hunger was a daily problem for many of these peasants, with most living on the bare edge of starvation. And yet, all the peasants were liable to pay taxes, whereas the nobility was immune from such taxation. Compounding this, peasants were also obliged to pay a tithe to the Catholic Church, which went generally to the aristocratic abbot. The clergy owned 10% of the land in France, but numbered fewer than 100,000, or roughly 0.3% of the population. The terms used by the French were the first estate for the clergy, the second estate for the nobility, and the third estate for the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. The third estate was largely responsible for financing the French monarchy, all of the affairs of state, the nobility, and the clergy. And, given the widespread debt of the monarchy, the peasants and middle class felt especially squeezed to finance two wars and lavish lifestyles of the elites of their society. There was also the emergence of political ideas from the Enlightenment and widespread publishing of salacious novels. The public at this time was becoming a force. Public opinion became a powerful arbiter. Some scholars looked to the ideas of the Enlightenment from thinkers such as Rousseau, Voltaire, Locke, Diderot, and others. But the overwhelming majority of the French population hadn't read any of the big Enlightenment philosophers. They might have heard about some of their ideas in the Atlantic world phenomenon of the coffee shop, but very few people were actually affected by Enlightenment thought. If we were to offer a parallel to contemporary society, how many of your average American people are reading Thomas Piketty or Milton Friedman to form their political and economic ideas? Many historians have argued that what pushed popular opinion was essentially smutty French pulp fiction, where the aristocracy of the monarchy was mocked for their extravagant lifestyle, sexual depravity, and other stuff. Think of it as like a weird pre-internet amalgamation of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, fake news, and the Twitterverse and all the other stuff that we get to deal with today, but in a much more quaint French form. Furthermore, there were myriad economic issues and agricultural failures. Compounding the rise of the public as a force and socioeconomic inequality were fundamental issues in the economy and agricultural failure. In the years immediately preceding 1789's revolution, France suffered under a drought, which may have been tied to a particularly bad El Nino cycle. This devastated the countryside and severely impacted the price of food in the urban areas. If you're the king and your people are pissed at your governing because they already feel squeezed from unfair taxation, just, bump the price of necessities, such as bread, and see what happens. Before the revolution, riots against the price of bread and unscrupulous merchants were a relatively common event. And this was compounded by the system of distributing grain, where mill owners had control over the price of flour and therefore grain and bread, breeding resentment against the system. France had one of the strongest economies in Europe, but the gains in the economy were not distributed equally. It had a huge agricultural workforce and a broad agrarian base, especially considering male peasants. And it was undergoing industrialization and had 6 of the largest 35 cities in Europe. But it had a huge national debt as well, largely incurred by the 7 Years' War, but also by French participation in the American Revolution. In fact, the French state was nearly bankrupt, from a combination of war debt and lavish spending. The French had lost one war and participated in another, and thought that the solution was further militarization through internal lending and debt. In the 15 years between the outbreak of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the debt of the French state increased by more than 50%, from 8 billion liras to 13.5 billion. And finally, a free life lesson from me. If you're ever the unpopular monarch of a large yet troubled nation, never give in to the public to participate the opportunity to participate in government, including the nobility. Autocracy is just so much easier, especially on paper. Louis XIV had a lot of issues facing his regime in early 1788, and his hopes to decrease France's financial troubles by taxing the nobility had flopped because the nobility refused. So, he called the Estates Generales, or an assembly of representatives from the 3 estates, the nobility, clergy, and bourgeoisie. The calling of the Estates Generales really represents the monarchy's final loss of control over France and the beginnings of the French Revolution. Louis XIV called the Estates Generales and quickly regretted it. He soon locked them out of their meeting area, and they adjourned to a set of tennis courts in Versailles. There, the representatives of the Third Estate voted to form a national assembly and made clear that they were going to exercise the duties and prerogatives of the state. Delegates from the First and Second Estates quickly joined them, and the monarchy effectively acknowledged their legitimacy. Events in Paris in July 1789 escalated the situation. The city was already on the verge of insurrection. On July 18, intoxicated with liberty and enthusiasm, Parisians took up arms. The rumor began that the French military had begun stockpiling weapons in the fortress of the Bastille, an infamous political prison. The fear was that these arms were meant to suppress the National Assembly, and regiments of Swiss and German mercenaries exacerbated these fears. Little warning tip, ever having armed foreign mercenaries in your capital city to suppress an insurrection is probably not a good sign. The crowd gathered outside of the Bastille, and after some fruitless negotiation, forced its way inside. These were basically the first violent actions of the French Revolution. And the whole, parading around with heads on spikes things got a bit old really quickly, so they just soon started piling them in baskets. In August, the National Assembly produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, essentially a constitution and policy document for the new republic. Monarchical France was done. In September, women marched on Versailles, demanding further reforms to address bread shortages, and pushing to end the efforts to block the National Assembly. And these women hauled with them a bunch of cannons and muskets, and killed several of the palace guards at Versailles, the seat of the French monarchy. The Constitution of 1791 transformed France into a constitutional monarchy with an elected legislature. Well, great, this didn't quite address the full gravity of the situation, and the Legislative Assembly quickly devolved into factionalism and chaos, while on the streets it was nearly civil war. The Assembly quickly declared the French Republic, and soon faced war from other monarchies of Europe, attempting to squash this dangerous republican impulse in France. And the situation further devolved with the Reign of Terror led by Robespierre. This is where the guillotine famously came into effect, disassociating the heads of the nobility and clergy from their bodies. Off went the heads of the king, the queen, many nobility, lots of priests, the proto-feminist Olympe de Gouges, and then the members of the Chop Hoppy Committee of Public Safety, including Robespierre. At least 16,000 people died by the guillotine. Some estimates exceed 40,000. After the Crisis and Committee for Public Safety finished their beheading spree, the French government shifted to the Directory era, which rolled back a lot of the excesses of the crisis. But it was a rather weak governing body and couldn't cope with the unrest and disarray. In 1799, a Corsican military officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, threw a happy little coup d'etat and began the Napoleonic era. He effectively ruled as a military dictator and involved France in a bunch of wars across the continent to spread the revolution. I don't have time to go fully into this, but it's a fascinating era. And if you want more, I recommend a course by Catherine Dunlop at Montana State University about the French Revolution directly. I think she usually teaches it every few semesters, and I'd highly recommend it. That's it for this mini lecture, and we'll pick it up in discussing the Haitian Revolution.